Good evening, everybody. Today it will be my third lecture series. I've already mentioned in my Facebook profile as well as in LinkedIn and YouTube that I'll be delivering the lecture on the gross domestic product. Now, we have already discussed in our first and second lecture series, especially on the second lecture series, that the importance of annual budget and the union budget of India, and what are the implications of the union budget of India on our economy, especially in the Indian context. But during the speech of any finance minister, whether it's right now the present incumbent Honorable Finance Minister and Corporate Affairs, Srimati Nirmala Sitharamanji, as well as any finance minister, the importance of gross domestic products or the GDP, in short form it is called, is the full form of abbreviation is the gross domestic product, comes into the picture. So even the prime minister also of the country, or any state's chief minister of any state of in any part of the country, they obviously speak about the gross domestic product. So what is the gross domestic product? Gross domestic product is actually a monetary measure of the total market value of the final goods and the services which are actually produced and rendered during a specific period of time by a country. And this is very important to know that the major components of the GDP or the gross domestic products are consumption, government spending, net exports means export minus imports, means the goods and services that were sending abroad overseas are the exports, and the goods and services that we are receiving inside our country are the imports. So it takes into consideration the export, the net exports. If the exports exceeds the import, then then it is considered to be a surplus export, and that is a net export. And the investment, so changing any of these factors can increase the size of the economy. So when we talk about that our GDP is increasing, our GDP has surpassed some of the developed nations of the in the world right now, like for example UK, Japan, Germany, France, and some of the EU nations and the Asia Pacific nations. Then obviously these factors takes into consideration while calculation of the GDP. GDP is actually calculated as in the form of a measurement. Means we, when in economics we actually recognize any kind of data, then the recognition of data and the presentation of the data is to be done quantitatively. For example, if the population growth through a mass immigration can raise the consumption, for example, we have got 140 crore the population in our country, so the rate of consumption is very high. So when we talk about our GDP, in this gross domestic product, PPP, the full form is purchasing power parity, whether we are able to purchase at the same rate with the in tandem with the inflation of the country. So there are actually two aspects of GDP. One is a GDP nominal rate and GDP purchasing power parity. So, however, the GDP is not a measure for the overall standard of the living or the well-being of the country. It is actually an economic measure, and the recognition which has been of the measurement which has been done by the economic survey also. I've also mentioned in my previous lecture series, on the second lecture series, about the importance of the annual budget. Before presenting any kind of annual budget, the government of India or any country as such, they undertake the responsibility of producing an economic survey of the country. They want to see that what is the larger picture or the macroeconomic factors which are evolving around the country, and what are the factors which determine the growth and the size of the economy. If you see any kind of the paper readings or the newspaper articles or the magazines, we all talk about regarding our size of the economy, that we are approaching a 10 trillion economy. Right now we are already in the 5 trillion bracket economy, and we are approaching by 2030 we will be 10 trillion economy. Means 10 trillion economy means the size of the economy will be in the terms of the GDP. Now when we divide the total GDP by the population, it gives an ideal rough measure of the GDP per capita. And several nations and international economic organizations such as the OECD, the full form is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and International Monetary Fund, IMF, have maintained their own definitions of GDP, because this is very important to understand that the international parameters of understanding the GDP is very important, because GDP is often used as a metric of a international comparison as well as a broad measure of economic progress. Now, it serves as a statistical indicator of national development and progress, and the total GDP can also be broken down into contribution of each industry or the sector of the economy. I've already spoken about the nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is useful when comparing the national economies on the international market using the current exchange rate. To compare the economies, for example, when we are comparing, for example, now we are comparing our economy with the EU countries or the advanced nations like UK, Japan, France, Germany. When we are comparing our economy or the economy of India with other nations, then it can be adjusted over the by over the rate of the inflation by comparing the by real rate instead of the nominal value. For example, cross country comparison GDP figures are often adjusted for differences in the cost of living. For example, the cost of living in India might be different from the cost of living in the EU countries, or in the countries or USA, or Canada. So the cost of the living is usually determined by the GDP purchasing power parity, which is called the PPP. So GDP per capita at purchasing power parity can be useful for comparing the living standards between the nations. And it is a large topic which actually revolves around many economic factors. There is a net national product, NNP factor, or the factor cost. What are the imports and the exports? How the Reserve Bank of India takes into picture the GDP, how Ministry of Finance takes the picture of the GDP, how the overall the economic data which is produced by some of the other agencies, like there may be private agencies like CMIE, they also have got assumptions on the GDP. So GDP has always been criticized for leaving out the some of the key main factors. There are also criticalities and the limitations of calculation of the GDP. For example, the externalities such as the resource extraction, environmental impact, or unpaid domestic work. These are also taken into consideration. Now, if there is a kind of an alternative economic indicator such as the drought economies using other measures such as the human development index or a better life index, it is a better approach of measuring the effect of the country on the human development and the well-being. So my video has been a little bit short in this matter. I will continue this kind of GDP and what are the factors which actually affect the economy of the country, and what are the parameters that a nation or the Ministry of Finance actually takes into consideration while calculating these economic factors. Thank you very much for joining.